everyone. This is Andrew Owen at the University of Minnesota, and I want to thank you all for joining us. We'll be starting in just a moment here. I do want to make sure that folks are able to hear me. If you're able to, and you can type a quick yes in the chat box, it'll just confirm that we're coming through to folks. Excellent. I'm seeing some responses there, so it sounds like my voice is at least leaving the room, which is a great place to start. And again, thanks all for your time. Before we jump into the main part of our presentation, I want first to turn things over to Jean Wallace at MnDOT. MnDOT is the lead agency on this pooled fund project. And Jean is the Assistant Director for MnDOT's Modal Planning and Program Management Division. She also serves as one of the liaisons and champions for this project. Jean, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Andrew. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, great. Well, thanks very much. I really appreciate that you're all joining us today. And Andrew, I appreciate that the Accessibility Observatory is hosting this webinar. You know, it's an exciting time to be working with the transportation agency. There's certainly no shortage of interest and work and performance metrics, and no shortage of opportunities either to continue to improve how we can measure system performance in more meaningful ways. So I want to say that the National Accessibility Evaluation Project has expanded our portfolio of performance metrics, giving us a more complete understanding of how well we are meeting the goal of connecting people to destinations that are important to them, such as jobs and education and healthcare and centers of commerce and activity. And that's really what transportation is all about, right? Another important facet about this study is that the national scope lets us compare our performance with other states and regions and metropolitan areas, which we found really important within MnDOT. And in addition, the project's advisory panel has served as a forum for sharing lessons learned and best practices as we work towards operationalizing accessibility and performance management and planning. And the advisory panel also has had the unique opportunity to shape enhancements to the existing study to build on the benefit to each agency. And the Access Across America reports have helped raise awareness and generate discussions about important new family of transportation metrics. For Minnesota, we're realizing great benefit from this study, and more specifically, that the accessibility metrics help round out our suite of mobility performance measures, not just to include how easily people can reach their destinations, as stated earlier, and not just how fast they can travel or how much congestion they face. It's really a well-rounded identity of what transportation performance really is. MnDOT has been reporting job accessibility by auto in our annual transportation performance report, and we will be reporting job accessibility by auto and transit on our new soon-to-be live performance website. So we're really excited about that. And measuring accessibility is also consistent with MnDOT's plans. Our statewide multimodal plan identifies providing greater access to destinations as part of our critical connection strategy, and identifies job accessibility by auto and by transit as performance measures related to the critical connections objective within our statewide multimodal transportation plan. And project scenario analysis is another big opportunity area for accessibility data analysis. MnDOT is looking at changes in accessibility for different scenarios and alternatives for the Reimagining I-94 project, which is the main east-west transportation corridor between Minneapolis and St. Paul. And finally, the Access Across America Auto 2016 report provides baseline data for annual comparisons of accessibility change, both by zone and block level and as an overall value for the region. And what we'll be watching is certain areas with completion of large construction projects in the next couple of years, such as our I-35W project in Minneapolis, our Interstate 694 project, and our Highway 610 completion, among others, just to see how this really, we'll be looking at the trends and the changes, and I think it'll be really meaningful for us. So just to wrap up, as I stated earlier, these are really exciting times for transportation agencies. We anticipate continued change in mobility and use of our transportation system, and we really believe that this addition is an important step forward in building a well-rounded suite of performance metrics. So that's why we're really a sponsor of this pooled fund study. So Andrew, I'll turn it back to you to take us through the rest of the webinar, but thank you again for allowing me to make some opening remarks, and thanks to everyone for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Jean. And thank you also for MnDOT's leadership on this project and the opportunity to work with you and all of our partners. So we're here to talk about our National Accessibility Evaluation Project. As Jean explained, this is a pooled fund project that's brought together participation from states across the country, including Washington, California, Minnesota, of course, Wisconsin, Iowa, Arkansas, Tennessee, Florida, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and the District of Columbia. We've been really happy with the geographic breadth of participation that we've had in this project, as well as a large variety in state size. And it's an indication that DOTs of all sorts are seeing value in accessibility as a way to look at how they're meeting their local transportation needs. My goal in this presentation is to share some of our motivations in this project, why we're pursuing the goal of measuring accessibility, talk to you a little bit about how we're doing it, share some of the results and products that we've achieved in this project, and then talk a little bit about what the future looks like from right now and what's coming up next. Just a couple of housekeeping notes before I jump in with both feet. First of all, it looks like everyone's microphone is currently muted right now. We'll just try to keep it that way. It'll work out best for everybody if we don't have echo effects and things like that. And then second, we encourage you to use the WebEx chat window to capture any questions that you have as we go through. We find that it works really well. If you can type down those questions, you don't have to hold on to them until the end. And then as we collect those during the presentation, we'll pull out those that we can address right away and include them at the end of the presentation. You also have the option as you type in those questions, you can send it as a chat to everyone, which is of course allowed, but if it's a question that you want to send directly to us, you can send it to Chelsea Arbery, who's the host up at the top of the participant list. So with that, again, thanks very much for sharing your time with us this afternoon. The National Accessibility Evaluation Project is motivated by an understanding that transportation exists to connect people to destinations that matter to them. Transportation has lots of things that happen every day. Cars drive around, we manage congestion, we monitor on-time performance of buses, we keep lanes clear in inclement weather. All those things are really important, but the importance comes from the fact that they connect people with destinations. That's the fundamental purpose, and we think it's important to measure how well we meet that goal of providing access. Also, measurement, and this is a really measurement-focused project. Measurement provides a foundation on which we can build planning for the future. So if we wanted to set goals of improving accessibility and providing more opportunity to people through our transportation systems, we need to start by measuring how we're doing right now and how we're improving, or in some cases losing ground year over year. We also are finding that a pooled fund approach to these questions provides some consistency, and it also avoids redundancy. States are able to get a lot of research innovation per dollar by putting it together, knowing that the metrics that we produce in this project can be applied equally well in Minnesota, Florida, and California, and North Carolina, and all of our partners. So we're finding a lot of benefits from that pooled fund approach. In the rest of this presentation, I'll first touch on what is accessibility and give us some background and what do these metrics indicate and why they're important. Next, I'll move on to the goals of the project, how we're implementing them, and what results we're finding. I'll share some examples of how some of our partners are starting to apply the accessibility results that we're producing. And then finally, we'll take a brief look at what's ahead, next steps in the project, and what comes next. So starting off, what is accessibility? We've hinted at it so far. Accessibility measures the ease of reaching valued destinations. And there's two important parts in that. There's the ease of reaching things. So accessibility metrics must reflect what the cost of travel is. It can be measured in different things. If you think about accessibility really, really broadly, it might be measured in money or time or distance or pollution emissions. There's lots of different ways to implement this. Right now, we're mostly focused on time. So we're talking about the time cost of travel. The other really important thing is the value to destinations part, and that's the benefit of travel. We don't spend 35 minutes sitting on a bus each morning. I don't, because it's fun to sit on a bus for 35 minutes every morning. I sit on that bus because it gets me to work, and I get to work with colleagues. I get to implement fun projects. So there's a trade-off here. There's the cost of travel, and there's the benefit. Accessibility captures both sides of that equation, which is one of the things that makes it a really powerful tool. Also, accessibility is about opportunities. It's about what can potentially happen. What things out there could I interact with? That makes it a big picture, long-term sort of metric that's about what are we setting the stage for rather than what is playing out on that stage every individual day. So as an example, to get ourselves something in our hands, an example of an accessibility metric might be knowing that from a particular location, I can reach 100,000 jobs within 30 minutes by transit, let's say. So that's the benefit, 100,000 jobs, with the cost, 30 minutes. And accessibility captures both of those in a single measurement. So to look at what we're talking about, and I find this is really important for the concept of accessibility, we're looking here at the Twin Cities, here Minneapolis, St. Paul metropolitan area in Minnesota, and we've mapped out accessibility by census block. So every single block indicated on this map, and there's lots of them, we could zoom in pretty far, but we're just looking at the whole region. Every block is colored based on what can be reached from there. So we pick up individual blocks and treat them as origins and say, if I'm here at this time, what could I get to? And in this region, the highest levels of accessibility are over 1 million jobs within 30 minutes during the AM peak period. And we can see already the relationship between accessibility and both land use and transportation. The highest values of accessibility sort of spread through the transportation network via major roads and highways. And then the highest values are centered on our employment centers, downtown Minneapolis, downtown St. Paul, some of the surrounding job centers show up as peaks, and then accessibility declines as you get further from them. We can measure the same thing. So this is access by driving. We can measure the same thing for transit. So we've zoomed in here to the core cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. We're looking at the same metric, jobs within 30 minutes by transit during the AM peak period. And we see very different values and a very different structure of how accessibility spreads through the region. And mostly it's because we're looking at two very different types of transport networks. Roads and highways are kind of everywhere. The transit network is much more limited, both spatially, there's only stops in some places, but also temporally. In terms of time, you can only get on a bus when it's there. The road you can sort of start driving on as soon as your car fires up. So we see very, very different patterns of accessibility. A key thing here, though, is that we're able to look at exactly the same metric for auto and for transit, and produce meaningful results that can be compared to one another and reflect real differences in those transportation systems. So another key feature of accessibility is that it's mode neutral. A metric like congestion on a highway, that's pretty focused on car travel. A metric like on-time performance of transit vehicles is pretty focused on transit. It's hard to take one and apply it to the other. But accessibility is something that can be applied to any mode. And that makes it particularly powerful when we're trying to understand the balance of investments that are made in different types of transportation networks in the same region. And then finally, I've hinted at how accessibility reflects both transportation and land use. And this makes it kind of an interesting metric to use in a DOT and MPO context that tend to focus really strongly on the transportation side of things, and land use will do what land use does. But accessibility helps us keep in mind that these two systems, transportation and land use, interact really strongly and depend upon each other. If you make a change in the transportation network, you'll see a change in accessibility. But you can also see accessibility changes from changes in land use. If people start to live in different places, if jobs locate in different places, if their densities change, those will show up as accessibility changes even without any changes to the transportation network. That's a really important property because it allows us to look beyond those very operational transportation networks and see to people's destinations. So let's get a little bit more detailed about the project, and we'll talk about its implementation and some of the results that we've been seeing. I'll talk about how we're measuring accessibility, what data we're using, what data we're producing, the reports that we're producing, and then some of the ways that we have enhanced and are continuing to enhance this project as it progresses. First of all, measuring accessibility. We've got some very broad input data requirements. We need to know about transportation systems, but also about land use. So we've focused right now on accessibility to jobs. And one of the reasons for doing that is that work travel is it's the largest driver of trips, though most trips are not work trips. But people care a lot about commuting and being able to get to jobs. We're very fortunate to have access to a national data set produced by the Census Bureau through their LEHD data program that provides an estimate of job counts at the block level across the country. We also need information about the transportation systems. On the transit side, that means collecting schedules from individual transit operators. So we have a list of several hundred operators that we go out and collect digital schedule files. We also need to know about the pedestrian network. Our transit accessibility calculations include the time spent walking to the transit network, maybe making some transfers and then walking to a destination once you've left the final vehicle. For that, we use OpenStreetMap. It provides a national pedestrian network in a consistent format, and that allows us to do end-to-end block-level trip calculations for transit. On the auto side, we're not as fortunate to have those open or public data sources, but we've had a lot of success working with national road network and speed data licensed from TomTom. This gives us the ability to reflect congestion at different times of the day. So we can look at how congestion impacts people's ability to reach jobs by comparing accessibility at congested times versus uncongested times. All of those data are processed by a core routing engine that's called Open Trip Planner. This is an open source piece of software that was initially developed for transit journey planning. It was expanded to provide some analysis tools, and we've done some additional work to move it from transit focus to include auto and walking and biking as well. One of the great parts about working with this as an open source tool is that we're able to add extensions to it so that we can easily parallelize these computations. Running these calculations for every single one of the 11 million census blocks that make up the U.S. takes a long time, so you want a lot of computers working on it at once. And thanks to this open source framework, we've been able to make extensions that let us get done in a few days what otherwise might have taken a few months. So that's a quick look at how we're calculating accessibility. Let's turn next to what we're producing. At the fundamental level, this project is about creating new data sets, measuring access across the country, and providing that data to people who need it. looking at the data sets that we produce, we share these data sets at the block level. So that's a pretty high level of detail, especially in urban areas, and segmented by travel time. So for each individual block, you'll have records that indicate what can be reached within 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. We go up to an hour now. And for each block and travel time pair, we count the number of jobs that can be reached from that location within that travel time. And those are also categorized by wage level, by industry classification, and some other tabulation fields that are provided by that census data set. We're very happy that there are no restrictions on the use or distribution of these data sets. They become the unrestricted property of the partners in this project, which means that they effectively become public data. And we're excited to be growing this data foundation that we think can improve all sorts of other research applications out there. We also take that data and turn it into some sets of reports. Some of you may be familiar with our Access Across America series of reports. These are national in scope. We look at the top 50 metro areas by population around the country and provide accessibility summaries for them. We're able to provide rankings. Everybody loves rankings, and they generate a lot of attention. We're very pleased with these reports as a way to raise awareness of accessibility metrics, what they indicate, and how they can be used to understand transportation and land use patterns throughout the country using the same comparable metrics. We also produce sets of reports that are targeted locally for each of our partners. So for example, every year we put together a report specifically for MnDOT that summarizes the accessibility results across the state by county, by MPOs within the state, and breaks down trends in accessibility, what's rising, what's declining, so that each of our partners get a much more focused local view of accessibility within their jurisdiction. As an example of some of the information that we provide in those reports, this is our accessibility scorecard for the Minneapolis metropolitan area from our most recent Access Across America auto report. And we record information like that region's rank in terms of job accessibility, rank in terms of congestion impact, which is a metric I'll talk a little bit more about later. And then we show some of the summarized data, jobs within different travel time thresholds, as well as the congestion impact at different travel time thresholds. So these scorecards give you a quick way to look at how accessibility stacks up in one region and compare it to others. I mentioned the rankings that we provide. These are our accessibility rankings covering 2016, which is the most recent year for which we've completed both transit and auto reporting. These are always interesting. Rankings are a great way to get people talking about the underlying data. We also find it interesting to tease out some trends simply based on these rankings and how they compare to ranking by population size. You can imagine a world where every metropolitan area made proportionally the same investment, for example, in their transit networks. And in that world, the transit access rankings presented here would be exactly the same as the rankings by population size, but they're not. Some areas perform better on transit rankings than their population size or their total employment would indicate. So, for example, San Francisco kind of punches above its weight in that respect. Seattle really does. Minneapolis, St. Paul does. But some metros come up a little bit short on these metrics. For example, the Dallas area has a ton of jobs. It ranks quite a bit below where its quantity of jobs would predict in terms of providing transit access to those jobs. So that's been a surprisingly useful, very simple metrics just based on these rankings that we can use to see what regions are performing very well in terms of providing access to the jobs that they have. Another goal that we laid out at the beginning of this project was not to be static. We knew what we'd be able to accomplish in that first year, but we also knew that it would get easier in the second and third and fourth and fifth years, and we wanted to make sure that we were continuing to expand what we were able to offer in the project. So we meet quarterly with our technical advisory panel to set our priorities in terms of where we're investing these project enhancements. Some of the things that we've done so far are we've developed a new metric that reflects the accessibility impacts of congestion, looking specifically at how much of a role congestion plays in limiting access to jobs, not just time spent in congestion, but what does it mean in terms of reaching destinations. So that's a metric that we've developed and we have been including in our Access Across America auto reports. As an example, again, looking here at the Minneapolis metropolitan area, this map indicates the accessibility impact of congestion. And areas which are darker brown on this map are areas where congestion plays a larger role in limiting access to jobs. Lighter colored areas experience smaller accessibility decreases attributable to congestion. And this has given us a sort of a new way to look at congestion. Instead of just how much time are people spending in congestion, we can look at what it means in terms of opportunity and how people and locations are limited in reaching those opportunities because of congestion. We also identified easier access to our accessibility data as a priority. We produce very large detailed data sets, and those can take some expertise and time to digest and get integrated into local GIS processes and data processes. So we've been working on a web mapping and data access service that allows people, for example, in ArcGIS to quickly connect to our map server and include accessibility maps in their own reports and map creation without needing to do any extensive data downloading or importing. So this is something that we're actually in, I'd say, the beta testing phase of right now, and we're looking forward to rolling this out more completely in the fall. We're excited about the possibility of seeing more and more accessibility data showing up in planning and evaluation maps based on people using this tool. We also, right off the bat, identified additional modes as something we were interested in expanding into. We started out with driving and transit and targeted the non-motorized modes of biking and walking as a high priority thing to invest in. And to that end, we've been exploring a method of evaluating bike accessibility that's based on a level of traffic stress scores. This is a method of evaluating individual pieces of a bicycle network based on the stress experienced by users of that piece of the network. So, for example, an LTS-1 facility is the facility that's the most comfortable to use. It's off the street. There's a physical barrier between it and any motorized traffic. Whereas at the other end of the spectrum, LTS-4 is the most stressful type of environment to bike in. So this would be no designated bike facilities, not even a painted lane, biking in mixed traffic on higher volume roads. And then in between, LTS-2 and 3 indicate different levels of dedicated bike facilities. And you can see, as looking at this series of maps, LTS-1, 2, 3, and 4, as users are more and more willing to bike in stressful environments, they're able to reach greater amounts of opportunity. So if we kind of look at that from a negative framing, we can say that a lack of stress-free biking environments is limiting people's bike accessibility to what we see, for example, in the LTS-1 map. If we made investments that turned those LTS-1 facilities into LTS-2 or 3 facilities, we'd be able to make improvements in what people are able to reach without experiencing a lot of stress while biking. And we can quantify that explicitly simply by subtracting these different scores. On this map, the darkest areas are the areas that would gain the most in terms of job access by bike if we were to make targeted investments in improving the stress levels of bike facilities in our cities. This is Minneapolis and St. Paul here. So this is an exciting new thing that we're developing. We're expecting our first Access Across America bike report and its associated data to be available this fall, and it'll include some of these LTS-based evaluations. Finally, one of the areas that our advisory panel identified as something we should expand on is looking at the connections between accessibility and freight. And this has been an interesting question to investigate because freight brings a different set of parameters and some new challenges into an accessibility view of the world. We need to think about different types of destinations. We're focusing right now on freight terminals and intermodal freight facilities because those are so much fewer than total numbers of jobs. It doesn't make as much sense to count up, for example, 3 rail terminals. You want to know things like how far away are they, how large are they. So we're exploring different types of data sets that could be pulled into our analyses to start applying accessibility to a freight context. We'll be looking at some pilot metrics about freight accessibility this fall, getting feedback from our TAP, and then hopefully setting a timeline for applying this on a national or maybe on a pilot location basis going into next year. So let's shift gears a little bit, and I'll provide some examples of how our partners can apply accessibility and are currently applying it in their practice of planning and managing transportation systems. The first big area for applying accessibility is in performance management. This is really the evaluation side. Where is access high and where is it low? And what can we learn about the reasons for those differences? What's making accessibility high? What's making it low? We can also take that question and look at it from an equity standpoint. If it's high, who's living in that location to experience that high accessibility? If it's low, who's living there and is experiencing low accessibility? Across the whole region, we can ask, how is access to opportunity distributed across the populations? There might be some groups that tend to experience lower than average access to destinations and some that experience higher than average access to destinations. So accessibility gives us a way of addressing equity questions in transportation in a new way that focuses on the destinations and on the opportunities rather than simply on access to transportation itself. This project is also providing an opportunity for agencies to support more local agencies with data that otherwise might not be available to them. So this is, a large national research project, and frequently cities, counties, often MPOs don't have the opportunity or the resources to participate in programs like this. So we're really happy to hear that some of our partners are finding a lot of value in taking the data sets that we provide to them and then making sure that they're also accessible from their local transportation planning partners like MPOs and cities. In particular, we've heard a lot of examples from Florida DOT, who's currently taking our accessibility reports and data and then going around the state and visiting their planning districts and their many MPOs to get feedback on what these metrics mean at a metropolitan level and how they might be improved, how we might change the communication so that they're most applicable and can best support local planning efforts. So we're looking forward to hearing some of the results coming out of Florida, getting feedback on that, and then hopefully rolling them into the larger project so that we can share those benefits and those lessons more broadly. Performance management is also concerned with how things are changing over time. And there's 2 big dimensions where we can apply accessibility here. first, how does access respond to infrastructure changes? So right now, this project takes annual snapshots, and we've had some success and learned some interesting things from looking at year-over-year accessibility and how it relates to transportation system changes. For example, here in the Twin Cities, we were able to do a before and after look at a new light rail line that connects downtown Minneapolis and downtown St. Paul, and see how that investment improved people's access to jobs, not just the total amount of improvement, but where that improvement happened and what neighborhoods down to the block level benefited from that transportation investment. Accessibility can also reveal how access responds to land use changes. If a large new job center opens up, maybe residential density in a location changes significantly, those will show up as very real accessibility changes. And this gives us a chance to see how much access is determined by land use versus by transportation. And they tend to change on different scales. Transportation changes are big million-dollar, billion-dollar investments, and so we see one once a year, sometimes once every 5 years in a region. There's a major transportation network change. But land use changes really every day as businesses open and close and new residents move in and some leave. We see a much more fine-grained pattern of changes on the land use side. And it's been very interesting to compare these from a performance management perspective. Finally, in performance management, this evaluation of accessibility and repeating it the same way on an annual basis builds a really sound foundation for applying accessibility in planning. By building that trend line, we can see what accessibility is doing today and over the past few years. That allows us to start imagining where we want it to go and how we can push it in that direction in the future. So as an example of this evaluative approach to accessibility and using accessibility as a way to get people thinking about what type of future they want, one of our partners, the District of Columbia, the District DOT, used accessibility as a component of their district mobility project, where they're looking at multimodal transportation in the district, and providing a variety of different lenses that people can use to look at congestion, access by transit, access by bike. So they've done really a fantastic job here of making accessibility attractive. I really like the design of this website, and the data here for this is transit access to jobs is based on the data that we produced in this project. It made me very happy to see that producing these very boring-looking data sets, if you get the right people looking at them, you can turn them into very compelling tools that allow people to explore that data and understand parts of their city in a new way. So looking a little bit more about the opportunities for applying accessibility in planning. Two big areas related to scenario analysis and prioritization. There's growing out of that evaluation, building the trend line and the sort of the baseline accessibility landscape, we gain the opportunity to evaluate planned improvements, make a transportation scenario, change some parts of the network, and then evaluate the accessibility impact of it. That's an opportunity maybe for prioritizing investments towards those that will provide the biggest accessibility benefit. We can apply the same method to land use development, or land use scenarios. If we're looking at different development opportunities or different regulation scenarios, we can play out how those would change the accessibility landscape in terms of access to jobs or maybe other types of destinations. Accessibility also gives us an opportunity to look at our current network and to identify gaps where infrastructure improvements would have the greatest accessibility benefits. So we saw an example of that in our LTS bike work, where we can show the locations where higher stress facilities are currently the greatest barrier to access by bike, and therefore where targeted investments might make the biggest difference. As an example of accessibility and planning, I was happy that Jean mentioned during the intro the work that we're doing with MnDOT in their Rethinking I-94 program. So this is a key highway segment in between downtown Minneapolis and downtown St. Paul. Some of the plans for it include the opportunity to add managed lanes, which would provide congestion-free car trips, as well as faster transit trips between the two central business districts. And as part of the pooled fund, we've effectively created the baseline data for this planning scenario. So now we're in the process of going in and measuring how accessibility will change in a scenario where we had a managed lane access in between these cities for both auto and for transit. Finally, we'll take a quick look ahead at what's coming up in the project right now and what the future looks like beyond that. So this summer we are transitioning from year 3 to year 4 out of 5 in our initial work plan for this project. So we still have 2 years of data production and reporting. We're also beginning conversations about what does a national evaluation look like after this initial 5-year run. We think that we've shown benefits that sustained annual evaluation of accessibility can bring, and we're hoping to have opportunities to continue working on that if it's still valuable. I've mentioned that we currently have some planned enhancements that will hopefully improve the value of this program over the next few years, adding bike data and reporting, adding our web mapping and data access service, and then continuing the conversation and developing some metrics that tie together freight and accessibility. In all of those conversations, our project advisory panel guides the development and the direction of the project, helps to set the priorities of the expansions that we work on year after year. So that's a great opportunity to talk about how you or your agency might get involved. If you want to help to guide that conversation, if you want to benefit from those local detailed accessibility reports and access to data sets, we do make some of that data available publicly via our own website, which you can visit at access.umn.edu. You can find our Access Across America reports there. For those of you in the audience who work at state DOTs, a key feature that I've discovered for a pooled fund is that it's very important to be approved for 100% SPNR funds, which we are, which effectively means that FHWA has said that it's okay to use 100% federal research and planning funds on this without needing a local match. And that can make it a lot easier to justify participation from a research budget. So that's a little bit focused on state DOTs. But we are also very eager to work with MPOs, municipalities, transit agencies, and other types of organizations. We've actually recently begun working with our local MPO, the Metropolitan Council of the Twin Cities, and I'm very excited about how more local transportation planning voices can help to guide the project in different ways and find some new opportunities beyond our state-level reporting that we've developed so far. If you are interested in getting involved, please do get in touch. Our website will provide the ability to, as I said, access our reports, data, also to contact us, access.umn.edu. Anytime we have new reports come out, we'll also announce them via Twitter at UMN-ACCOB, UMN Accessibility Observatory. And you're welcome to email me directly. That's Andrew Owen, aowen @umn.edu. So thank you very much for your time. I hope that this has been a useful overview of the National Accessibility Evaluation Project. I see a couple of questions here that have come in that we'll address. But But first, a very sincere thank you for sharing your time with us. Let's take a look at questions we're getting here. So one is focused on our LTS approach to bike accessibility and asking about walk accessibility. And this is a great question, and it's one that I've actually had some conversations about recently. Are there data sets of sidewalks that are complete enough to conduct a meaningful analysis to do something similar to LTS in a pedestrian context? My guess right now is that those don't exist at a national level. Coming up with an LTS-like score for pedestrian travel would, I think, require some very detailed measurements, things like width and condition of the sidewalk. Some places do measure that when they go out and do pedestrian network inventories. It's less common to see things like what's the relationship between the sidewalk and any adjacent traffic lanes. Whether or not there's a lane of parking can make a big difference in how stressful it feels to have 40-mile-per-hour cars going past you. If there are trees in between, that makes a big difference. So I think there is some data work that would need to be done to support it, but there might be opportunities for doing some local pilots, and I'd be curious if any of you have any thoughts about that. There's another question about accessibility being able to reflect different types of travel costs. I mentioned time costs, but people also pay for travel with money. Right now, the metrics that we're producing are all focused on the time cost of travel, at least in this National Accessibility Evaluation Project. We've also implemented some research projects with individual research sponsors that have brought in a monetary analysis. For example, that becomes very useful when you're talking about access that involves travel by toll lanes. And it becomes particularly interesting when you're looking at variable pricing toll lanes and see how the jobs reachable per dollar of toll fluctuates through the day in response to those variable pricing. So that is another type of cost that can be applied to accessibility. We haven't brought that work into the National Evaluation Project yet, but I think there may be some opportunities to do that. It also may come up in the freight conversation. So thanks for that question. Then we've also got a question here about the Open Trip Planner system that we use to measure accessibility and how it compares with a commercial product like Sugar Access that's provided by City Labs. So fundamentally, they're very comparable. They take information about the transportation networks, about the land use. They build that into a routable network. They run routing calculations roughly the same way. So a big difference there is, I'd say, in the flexibility of data sources. We've built this project around particular data sources in order to satisfy the products that we're trying to create. We need national scope data sources. But there's nothing in the Open Trip Planner tools that we use that tie us to those data sources. We can swap out different types of destinations, different network data sources. Sugar Access is, from what I've seen, and I have to say that I'm not a user of it, but I am familiar with some demonstrations. From what I've seen, it's tied with some specific data sources that are available through its interface. I think it has a particular road network and speed vendor whose data will automatically populate into the software. It has some work that will let you automatically import transit schedules. I don't know if it's possible to import external ones, like to build a custom network and import it into there. In general, Sugar Access appears to be much more focused on scenario evaluation of running a baseline, making a quick sort of parameterized, what am I trying to say, sort of a stylized change to the network, and then evaluating how accessibility responds to that. It's much less suitable for a large national scale annual evaluation of accessibility. So we've focused much more on the detail of an annual evaluation, and we do our scenario analyses as separate projects alongside that. I'll pause for just a couple moments here in case any final questions come in. Thanks for the good ones. I also want to mention that we're currently recording this webinar, so if you'd like to be able to share it with some colleagues, we'll make that available on our website, and we can share once that's posted via our Twitter account. I think we should also have the slides available as a separate download if you don't want to sit through the video and just zoom into your favorite map that I presented. You'll be able to do that. I don't see any other questions coming in, so I will say thank you very much for those questions that you did provide. Again, thank you all for your time, and if you are interested in participating in the National Accessibility Evaluation, or if you have other questions about accessibility and how it might be applied in other contexts or projects, I hope that you'll get in touch. Thank you all very much for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful afternoon.